Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized into a set of thematic courses. I am Amy Allen, the Senior Program Coordinator for Academic Engagement on the Lifelong Learning team. Thank you for joining our program, Food, Culture, Identity, and Community. This program is part of our theme, Food for Thought, which will examine the many facets of our relationships with food through scientific, cultural, policy, and health lenses. Today's program is the second session in the Food for Thought series, and will explore our shared humanity through our lifelong relationships with food. Joining us today as our host and moderator is Ellen F. Davis, the Amos, Ragan, Kearns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School. Ellen's research interests focus on how biblical interpretation bears on the life of faith communities and their response to urgent public issues, particularly the environmental crisis and interfaith relations. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Ellen.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, good afternoon. We enter into this conversation about food, identity, and culture at a time when that broad topic is increasingly in the awareness of our faculty, because it is increasingly in the awareness of our students at Duke. They know something is amiss in our relationship to food production and consumption. So today we inquire into how foodways shape us as a community, in our families and larger society, how it shapes us in literature, through policy and politics, how changes and losses happen across time, space, global cultural and economic shifts. I am a biblical scholar who once wrote a book with the unlikely title of Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture. I focus on reading Iron Age texts with a view to the chiefly agrarian culture from which those texts emerged, and also with a view to the fragile ecological zone of the Eastern Mediterranean. The biblical world was very often a hungry world, and the biblical writers were keenly aware of the fragility and brokenness in their own food systems, and also the need to cultivate and, yes, pray for healthy food systems. We have two distinguished guest speakers today. Laura Florand is Senior Lecturer of Romance Studies, with a focus on French literature and culture, and not incidentally on gastronomy. She is an award-winning writer and novelist whose work has been translated into 9 languages. Norman Wirzba is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology and Director of Research for Duke's Office of Climate and Sustainability. We are honored to have both of you with us. May I ask each of you to say a word about how food and foodways figure in your scholarship and teaching? Laura, maybe you'd begin.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. Foodways actually started entering perhaps into my field of production when I was writing a memoir early in my 30s, as 30-year-olds do about their life. But, it was a memoir about cultural connections when I and my husband met, and so many things happened around food, as both of us had big families, and these were the gathering points, right? And they were sometimes the points of rivalry or of testing each other, also about abilities to adapt to a new customs and new families. But so that was probably the kind of starting point of when I started really thinking about food as something I wanted to write about and talk about. And then from there, I moved into, just from fascination, into researching high-level chocolate and pastry making in Paris, and wrote 8 novels about that, set in that field. And then started developing a course that would take my students into the community, my French students into the community here, and make connections between French and Francophone cultures around food and local communities in their own cultures. So,
Norman, you often talk about what is delicious. Try to beat chocolate and pastry.
I know. I'm trying really hard, Laura. You really upstaged me from the start here. I came into this as a farm kid in Western Canada. I thought I was going to be a farmer, and I grew food. We had cattle, chicken, pigs, had a huge garden, big root cellar. Food was everywhere in my imagination, and thought I was going to be a farmer. And then I didn't, because it was a horrible time to try to be a farmer. Economic contexts were just really, really tough for anything like that. But then I went to graduate school where I studied theology and philosophy, and was surprised to discover that never does a farmer show up on the syllabus. And I thought, this is strange, because food is one of the most basic ways that people have for connecting to their land. It's certainly one of the primary ways that we connect to each other in the cooking and sharing of meals with each other. And so I was just puzzled, why is food or farming not on the agenda in higher ed, at least in philosophy and theology? And so many years later, I ended up writing a book called Food and Faith: A Theology of Eating, where I tried to open up why I think food is such an important lens through which to understand all sorts of questions that we have about life, the meaning of life, and all sorts of things. So it's a wonderfully expansive topic.
I think we can already see that there's continuity and considerable difference in your angles of vision on this. In each of you in your teaching and writing shows a multifaceted awareness of the foundational role of food practices in shaping our humanity and keeping us humane. To start us off, would you name for us one thing that seems to you most essential to a healthy food culture?
I would say connection. So connection to each other. If food is fundamental to our social connections, and in fact, our evolutionarily speaking, we probably evolved to be such social animals, in part because of our desire to, or the way we evolved to share food sources. And connection also to the origins of our food, the people who produce it, the communities and the land and the environment too, I would say.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. I think context is really crucial for us to understand. I think one of the things I want students to understand is that we're living in an entirely unprecedented moment in human history, where as eaters, we need to know nothing about where our food comes from or the social ecological context in which food is produced and made available. I mean, think, we have grocery stores, we have online food outlets where we can just click a button and the food shows up at our door. People even 100 years ago could have never imagined something like that. And by not appreciating the social ecological context of our food, which means things like, is the water available and clean? Is the soil fertile? Are the animals, healthy? Are plants healthy? Is diversity of plant and animal life, foregrounded, right? Those sort of basic things that are essential ingredients in a good food system. We don't have to know anything about them. And by not knowing about them, we're not really in a position to advocate for their well-being. And when that happens, we're putting ourselves in a pretty dangerous position.
I often say to my students that no people has ever lived as far from the world of the Bible as we do. And it makes it very difficult to understand what we're reading. So now I'd like to turn to your specific areas of expertise and look at the larger context for that. Norman, would you comment on current food systems that shape our national policies, our global practices, how that relates to sustainability and indeed to climate change, in which you're now so much engaged?
Yeah. Sure. I think one thing to start is to say that, for a very, very long time, food systems were incredibly diverse, depending on where you were in the world. But what is, I think, unique about our time, again, is that we're seeing a much more uniform food system that's being first of all, developed here in the United States, but now being exported around the world. And there are several features of this food system that I think is important for people to know. One of them is simply the factor that we call the consolidation of the food sector. And that means that a small number of very large corporations now dominate almost all aspects of the food system, whether you're talking about meat, dairy, vegetables, fruit, what have you. And this is a system that is geared primarily to treating food as a commodity, which means it's a commodity that now is evaluated and produced in terms of things like efficiency, things like profitability, or especially a big one is transportability and storage, because the supply lines that bring us our food can sometimes be hundreds or even thousands of miles. So a tomato, which if you grow it in your backyard or in a pot, when you pick that ripe tomato, you can have it on your counter for what, maybe 2 days before it starts to spoil? Well, think about the tomatoes that show up in a grocery store, right? Those tomatoes had to be picked well before they were ripe. And so when you get it at the store, it could have been sitting on a truck or in a distribution center or a warehouse for weeks. And the result, of course, is that when you eat that tomato, it has almost no flavor and no nutritional value, right? This is a feature of a system that is not geared toward two very, very important things that we've mentioned: the health of eaters, but also the health of the ecological context of the food production process itself. So that's a big feature of our food system now. And the Farm Bill that we have in the United States in particular is really geared toward the production of commodities. And it's kind of surprising when students learn that fruits and vegetables are considered a specialty crop and therefore don't qualify for many of the subsidy programs that exist within the Farm Bill. So one of the things I'm hoping will happen is that as students start to understand something about food systems, they will come to see that as citizens, they have a role to play in advocating for a system that really prioritizes the health of eaters and the health of the communities and the landscapes that grow our food.
Norman, if I could ask you for just one phrase to end this.
Yeah.
If food is not a commodity, what is it?
Oh, yes. That's a great question. I mean, the short answer is that it's a gift.
Okay.
Right. And I think the experience of people who grow food or garden or whatever is, yeah, you do everything you can to try to create the conditions in which plants will grow and animals will flourish. But in the end, you realize you can't control those things. And so when it does come, it's a small miracle. It's a gift in which you recognize this is a good world that we live in. I mean, I try to remind myself and fellow students that one of the most amazing things about our world is it has the potential to taste delicious. And that's just incredible.
Okay, I'm going to hold on to that. It's the difference between commodity and gift. Laura, would you speak to us about the presence of food in literature? Something I'm guessing that most of us, well, I know this because I teach literature, most of us don't notice the presence of food in literature very much. And yet, invariably, it's there from ancient texts to the present, because without food, there's no life to tell a story about. So would you just speak about that a bit?
Yeah, I think what you said there about no life to tell a story about is beautiful. And I think actually it links to what Norman said about food being a gift. I think that actually, just to follow up on that really quickly, made me think of, I had my students at Loaf, the bakery, for a workshop this weekend. And one of the things he mentioned to them that he would really love for them to come away with is knowing how much work goes into, the bread they buy, food they eat. And that it's done, especially, small producers are, especially they're doing it in part because of kind of as an act of love. It's something that they love and they believe in their community. And I think that, so to come back to literature, that we see, one of the things we see in literature over and over, and I mean, there are foodie books that concentrate on food, but even when they don't, is like I was saying, when I was first writing my memoir, was how food just meals together and food were present all the time in the stories that I was telling about how these two cultures came together and how these two families came together. And this is something you see over and over again in literature, where it becomes a locus, if I may sometimes of dispute, sometimes of breaking from each other, but often of coming together, the nostalgia in text for foods. So one of the first things I ask my students to do is tell their own food stories and seek out the food stories of their parents and grandparents, and how those tie to their sense of who they are and who their family is. So I think I'm getting a little bit off track because I'm starting to go into my course, because I just Sunday had a workshop with them and we were talking about a lot of their food connections.
Well, that's actually okay. If you
So I'm
want-
talking less about established literature than the stories that we all have.
That's
but
all right. Go with that.
Yeah. So I do think so, in the story, and I think that also food becomes such a key element in literature, often because it's just, first of all, as we said, it's fundamental to our humanity. We evolved to share food. And so we all have stories and all can identify with food, even if it's not one of our own foods that we're familiar with. But also when you're writing, of course, it's full of sensations. And it's full of emotions. And so being able to talk about the scents and the tastes, the sounds of food, is a way that I have a text that I share where the author is a Tunisian author who's talking about who's writing a letter to her grandmother after her passing, and the passage that my students love the most, and they actually love it more than like Proust's passage on the Madeleine, or she writes about her grandmother's love of black coffee. And she always drank it black, and that became a symbol of her character, and how the author, as she grows up, she starts taking her coffee black too, because it's kind of a connection to the strength of her grandmother. So things like that even if you don't like black coffee, I don't, you can feel that resonates with you.
Thank you. So I'm going to sort of continue that line of thinking. Norman, maybe you'd say something about how food relates to family identity, to family history and culture, learning
Yeah.
practices in the kitchen, at the table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, my own particular context is I grew up in an immigrant family in Western Canada. They were mostly folks who had been living in Central Europe during the Second World War. And so in my food imagination, there are story after story of people who were starving. How, as war erupts across Central and, well, all of Europe, there was no food to be had. And so people were foraging, they were starving, they were hungry, they were doing all kinds of things to just barely survive. And even when the war ended, that didn't solve the problem, because there were so many people who depended upon farms that had been destroyed, right? Orchards that had been destroyed, livestock gone. So I heard so many stories about how hungry these people had been growing up and coming through the warriors, which then was so striking to me, because as I grew up with these people, they were incredibly generous with their food, right? So my father in particular, he made it a point to make sure that the pantry, was always full, right? So there was canned food, there was processed food that could be stored over a great length of time. The root cellar was crammed full of all the vegetables that we grew. We raised 200 chickens because we knew we would be giving most of those chickens away. And my mother, she grew a baked cake like a mad person. I mean, she would do a dozen cakes a weekend because we constantly had people over and we're giving them food. And so this became a big part of my imagination, how there is this always danger of not having food, but then when you do have it, how important it is to share it. And so one of the things that I especially wanted to do when I was getting older is learn these cake recipes that my mother made all those years, so that I can now share them with other people. And it's just a wonderful continuation, even though I've never understood or really felt the kind of hunger my parents and grandparents did. But it's lovely to share these recipes with the food that we can give to other people.
Well, as your friend and colleague, I know that for you, giving a cake is the language of love.
Oh, yes. And, this is something that is another really important thing to say, is that when you make something for somebody else, what else can it be but a declaration of your love for them? Which is why getting an invitation to a meal is such a beautiful thing.
I love
Thank
that.
you.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's so true and it's beautiful.
Laura, did you want to say more about that, about family and passing down that sort of intimate kind of knowledge and culture?
I mean, I think Norman said it beautifully, but it made me think of how, so many families, my family included, that cookbook is, so some families someone in the family will coordinate to like collect the recipes and print up a cookbook for the family of family recipes. Or it might be that it's like grandmother's cookbook. My mom has a cookbook where she typed up all her recipes and then put in all her little clippings. Like, who gets that cookbook, right? Is because I'm one of seven. But it's like because it's it's almost the value that holds. And I just had my students actually in the rare book room as well, where we're looking at these old cookbooks that they have from hundreds of years ago, where usually women were writing by hand their recipes as a it's as something they also thought was very important to pass on to the future, right? So we are seeking out this, our past and our identity through these recipes that we inherit. We're also trying to pass them on. And even, in cookbooks, one of my students was pulling out a quote from 100 years ago, this fear of losing that our connections with food sources already, that people don't remember how to do this, and people are losing the ability to do these things. And this fear that by losing some of our capacities with food, we were losing something really very vital.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can I
And
just say one thing too? I mean, when I teach students in a class that I do on food, I associate good things with food and eating. But I've learned that for a lot of students, it's not that way, right? For many of the students that I teach, they do not have a love relationship with food because either the food makes them ill, right? Think about people who have, gluten intolerance, right? What in the book I wrote, I'm so proud of the chapter on bread. And then one of my students said, I can't eat bread. And suddenly my whole world just went, oh my goodness, right? And so I think for people who have real concerns about what they can eat, what they can't eat, how they are afraid that the food will make them ill or the food will make them fat or whatever, it's now a contentious space in which to try to teach, and it requires a lot of sensitivity now when trying to engage people around food, because what I assume about food may not be what other people assume about food.
We actually I started doing a section in my course on, why we might reject food and different reasons, but the text we look at is actually for a cultural reason or a loss. The author is narrating her childhood when she was 8. Her parents had to flee from Iran for political reasons, and they're in Paris. And her dad tries to bring the mom and the daughter croissant. So,
Mm.
and they flat out refuse to eat them. They will not eat them because they are so unhappy to not have their Iranian bread, lavash, and not be with the grandmother that they miss so much, and the father ends up eating them all in like a rage of, in spite, like, because he wants to make them happy, of course. And later the author, as a grown-up, loves and misses croissants when she's traveling other places. But sometimes the rejection, like, yeah, everybody's relationship with all foods is not positive, right?
so let's sort of expand to wider context and talk about how in social contexts, food holds tradition, but also becomes a marker of major social change. And sometimes that's in a religious context, not always. Um, and what happens when there's major cultural change across time, across geographic space, sometimes involuntary change when people are expelled or forcibly removed from their traditional lands? Um,
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think, in the teaching I do, I often have students read indigenous writers because for them, it is often the case that the connection with land is absolutely crucial to their own identity, their cultural symbols, the meaning that they derive from life. And so, of course, in many of these traditions, the tribes, the communities have been forcibly removed from their land, and so they lose the ability to draw from the land their very life, right? And this is something that is really, really important. And Robin Kimmerer made this point beautifully, I thought, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, when she said, when you have cultures that are landed people, which is what most cultures have been, when landed people no longer work the land by either hunting, foraging, or farming, they lose the ability to sense that the land loves them, that the land provides for them, that they actually belong to the land, right? That it's fitting for them to be there when they cooperate with the land, because the life of the land and the life of the community of people is benefited. Now, when you rip people out of that context and you place them on reserves, as often happened in the American and Canadian context in particular, they don't see the land as a place that loves them any longer. And I think one of the questions that we have to face is that as people who have not been landed for very, very long, we are the people who don't sense that kind of visceral connection to a land and the feeling that the land is the place of our belonging. And so we feel alienated from the land. And that alienation, Kimmerer argues, I think quite rightly, that alienation creates a kind of psychic disturbance. It's like growing up in a family where you never felt that you were loved. Imagine growing up in a world where you don't feel that you're loved by the land, or that the land is a place where you belong. And when that happens, we end up doing all kinds of compensatory strategies to try to make it look like we matter and that the things we do matter. And I think one of the things that's so important for us to try to recover is a sense for the value of the land and the life that grows out of it, so that we can affirm each other's existence in it.
I'll just note in response to that I've done a fair amount of teaching in East Africa, which is a place of a great deal of violence. And I felt self-conscious about speaking about Bible and land as a complete outsider to that region. But it was the thing that people most wanted to hear, because they said all our conflicts finally come down to land. It's degradation. It's being taken out of our hands. So thank you. Laura.
So I was thinking about what Norman was saying about braiding sweetgrass, and I may have lost track of the question.
Okay. So what happens when major cultural change happens? Voluntary or involuntary?
Yes. One of the most, vivid examples we have in our own country, in addition to Indigenous people, is, of course, the trauma of slavery and how that disrupted, transmission of knowledge, the foods people ate. There's often a story about women hiding seeds in their braids as they come over, and that might be apocryphal. We don't know, but because the foods were so crucial to, women are still to this day, and in West Africa, definitely there's strong kind of what we call peasant movements in French, to where women are considered the seed savers, the people who preserve agriculture. And so having this kind of disruption, you see the trends, you see both some of what is lost and some of what people manage to hold on to by replacing one vegetable with another that can grow here, like yams to sweet potatoes. And I think one of the interesting things you're seeing now, in the past couple of decades at least, is a really strong effort to regain, heal, regenerate those connections and that knowledge. I think if anybody's seen the High on the Hog series that Netflix did, that was quite, a quite lovely, kind of very accessible introduction to this work and this process. Some of the other things we see in literature, the Holocaust was a major disruptor. One of the texts we look at in my classes is written by an author who's trying to find her tracing her history. They receive a postcard. It was a Goncourt Prize book, and her grandmother receives a postcard with 4 names on it, and she starts trying to trace what happened. Where could that postcard have come from? It's the 4 names of the people who died in the Holocaust, and the whole in her family, and the whole book. There's these meals that are actually points of the family coming together, only so that the grandfather can tell them, now we have to break apart. So they come together for Passover, and the grandfather says, it's getting, really bad in Russia. I want everybody to pick a country and go. And so these series of meals like that. And then the last meal she talks about is she is Jewish, but is kind of kept distant from that identity, partly because her whole family, traumatized by the Holocaust, has, kept distant from that identity at post-war. And so she's invited as the girlfriend to a Passover dinner, where she's, a kind of hostile woman who's hosting the dinner keeps trying to challenge her to prove she's Jewish enough to really be there. And so that, I think, was it's a beautifully written book, and kind of illustrates how these disruptions can continue to carry with your food rituals and your they continue for generations, right? To cause problems and cause questions about your own identity and whether you belong if you don't know the food rituals of your culture, for example, or if they were damaged or disrupted, or you can no longer access them.
In different ways, but very real ways, both Judaism, as you've mentioned, and Christianity give a central place to a meal. Norman, you teach mostly theology students. Do you want to comment on that in any way?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no question that the meal has been important throughout the writing of Scripture, because there's just a basic existential fact, which is how we eat, who we eat with, reveals the values that we hold dear, right? And so we have all sorts of ways of saying that, well, we can't eat with these people, or we can't eat this particular food, or we must eat with these people, because when we eat with them, we show that we're breaking down the barriers that divide us, right? And so within Christianity, of course, one of the major rituals is the Eucharist, or it's called the Lord's Supper, or what have you. And the question is, why would that meal, which was originally just a very practical meal, these early Christians came together and they were told to eat in memory of Jesus. And the question is, why does the meal become that occasion? And I think one of the reasons that's the case is because when we eat, we have a chance to reflect upon how are we going to be with each other, right? We know this at a family dinner table, right? We have to learn table manners. We have to learn to share. We have to learn to make room for others. And I think that that meal is such a sort of universal experience that it becomes a lens through which a community or a tradition or a faith tradition can describe its values. And what the Eucharist teaches Christians, or what it ought to be teaching them, is that the table is open to all, and that we receive the nurture that Jesus provides, so that the people who partake of that meal can learn to be nurture to each other, nurture to strangers, and nurture to the world in return.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit about what you're seeing in your students themselves. Laura, you made reference to that briefly a few minutes ago. I noticed a big shift in my students, and I can even give the date. It was 2007 when there was a UN report on environment. It was by then fully circulated, and it was 2005 report, but it hit the library at this university in 2007, and it named industrialized agriculture as the primary driver of environmental degradation. So now we know that farming is no longer an innocent activity, if you can call the way we produce food farming. So I'm just interested, what do your students sort of know coming into your classes, and or what's arresting for them when you begin speaking about how we relate to our food sources or don't relate to them?
So it's kind of interesting, and I feel like those old cookbooks they were reading where the author's like, people don't know how to do this anymore. So there's disconnects that are surprising for someone from my generation. For example, students 18, 20 often don't know how to do some things like grate Parmesan, or they haven't grated cheese because it's always been pre-grated. They might not even know how to slice cheese, like a slice of cheddar, block of cheddar, because it's been pre-sliced. And so there's like a disconnect that comes down to the level like skills that for my generation was like, I mean, that you just had to grade. I mean, you graded your own cheese. If you wanted good cheese, you graded it, right? But so there's that kind of disconnect. And then there's one of the things. So you're going to think that my students never spend any time in the classroom, because another thing we did already this semester was to visit Duke Campus Farm. And they were asked to help weed the plants, but then they had to come to me and they're like, but I don't know what the weeds are and what the plants are, what the ones we want to keep are and what the weeds are. What's the difference between like the beans and the weeds? And so they just hadn't had any connection. Then they actually loved doing the connection, even though it was like a hot, humid day and I was a little worried they would, because I was hot. I mean, I've weeded before and it wasn't a revolutionary experience to me, but I was hot, but they actually really loved it. And one of the things they talked about quite a lot, and that goes back to some of our other conversations, is how while they were connecting with the land and learning things about, learning to recognize a weed, they talked a lot about talking to each other, like the stories they were exchanging as they were working in ways that they never do in a classroom. That actually, I think that's one of the things that made me start when you asked about a healthy food culture, talk about, connection, because I think that is one of the things we have lost with the efficiency of our food system now. I mean, it's convenient and it's certainly helpful when you're working a long day and you get home and you don't have to weed the garden and you don't have to make a meal. You can, but those tasks were moments of connection. So when women were making couscous, which actually they still do in North Africa, but it's going out of style to do because it's very labor intensive, that they were, rubbing the couscous and talking the whole time. They were chatting and exchanging stories, and that was a space where they did that. Or when my students were stripping herbs at one point to save the dried herbs, and they were just telling so many stories, and they still talk about how much they love doing that. So yeah, I think I always come back to that like human connection, but it is also connection with land, connection with food. But all of those things take a little bit of time. And once we remove the time and effort, we lose those other things as well.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Laura. I mean, I find that so many times now, younger people, they feel disengaged because they've often not through any fault of their own, they've just been rendered passive by a food system that says, we'll take care of everything. And all you got to do is pop it in a microwave and push some buttons and you'll have it. Or just dial a number and it'll be delivered to your door, right? The kind of passivity now in so much of our eating system is really striking. But what I find with students is that when they are given a chance to engage, right, exercise some agency by actually working, whether that's in a kitchen or in a garden where they do some gardening work or they do a little bit of baking, first of all, they're surprised by it because they've never been asked to do it or never been required to do it. And all sorts of insights emerge in the process of those activities of gardening or cooking. It doesn't mean that they're going to be automatically good at it, right? Because it takes skill. And I think also it's easy to become frustrated because gardening and cooking can be difficult, right? If you don't know what you're doing, you'll have a lot of frustration. But it's a process. And I think what is valuable to communicate to people is if you're feeling very lonely, which many people are, and feeling isolated and cut off, one of the problems might be that you're not engaging with each other. You're not engaging with your world, either through cooking, sharing meals, or growing gardens, growing food together. Because as you're right to say, those have been the activities through which we exercise social relationship.
Thank you. We've only got a few more minutes, and I'm going to ask each of you I'm going to ask something just slightly more personal. If each of you would name one food item that for you evokes a connection to something beyond yourself, community, nature, the past, even death, birth or death, what would that food item be? And just in a few words, why?
So mine is easy. I could have picked many, but one is, it's the Prince Regenten torte. It's a German tort that has about 8 or 9 layers of dough with a beautiful chocolate pudding and then a chocolate ganache on top. And the reason that cake is so important to me is it was like the most celebratory occasion at which that cake appeared because it's very labor intensive. It's really easy to mess up. And so when I make it, I evoke the whole of my family's background and it evokes a celebratory condition where we are right now when we eat it together.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Laura,
Like Norman, there's so many things you could talk about because I am also from the generation for when there was a death or an illness in the family, all the neighbors brought food and loaded the table and things like that. So, but I actually think I'll mention one that is part of my adult identity because I did form an identity around chocolate and high-end chocolate, like really luxury chocolate. And one of the things that it was actually really touching and really interesting to me. So I grew up in rural Georgia, and chocolate at that time, if you could, if you could get like dark Hershey's, that was already a step up from what you normally could get, right? And so when I lived in Paris and started discovering what was possible was actually at the growth of this kind of really big surge in chocolate gastronomy, if you will, in Paris and in France, is they kind of took on that as like a really important part of their cultural identity, is that they were the chocolate people that did the real good chocolate, not like the Belgians or the Swiss. That's just like, it's part of their belief about their own what we might call self power, but they call they use a sun metaphor for how their culture enlightens the world and just shines on the world. And so that was part of it. But I guess why I was going to pick it as something that was really important to my identity is it became my identity to other people. And one of the things that was really, really touching to me when my books were coming out is that readers would then make chocolates at home and send them to me as a gift, because it was just so, I loved it. I loved getting chocolates in the mail that had been homemade by readers as kind of a way of saying, oh, I want to share this with you after I read what you wrote.
Oh, I need to write books just like you, Laura.
I'm telling you, it's the field of research to be in. But yeah, it became and then it became also like what I would give everyone. I would be always the person who was supposed to know who the good chocolatier was and who the best was. And so that would be my gift to other people. So sometimes I guess what I'm saying is sometimes you can make your own food identity in interesting ways. But the point of connection remains that key part, right? The part that makes it so special and sweet.
well, thank you. This has been a delightful 45 minutes. And now we're going to invite our listeners to participate in this conversation with us. Sue Gladden says she would like to hear about ultra-processed food. And I'll remind you, this is a public conversation, so don't say everything you think about ultra-processed food, or if you say it in polite terms. Anyone want to begin with that?
I mean, I think I would say just that ultra-processed food is the ultimate symbol of commodification, where the interests of eaters and the interests or the well-being of the ground or the plants or the animals that provide our food are really not taken into account, right? The reason you ultra-process is that so you can have it sitting on a shelf as long as possible. And that can't be good for the way we eat.
Absolutely. And I would say then the other thing is, I go back to that connection and that time. Obviously people don't always have time. I mean, that's a luxury in and of itself. But part of this is a cyclical system where we're not supposed to have more time to spend time with each other or on things that matter to us, because it makes us then consumers of these prepared convenience foods that have in fact stolen from us the time we might have spent in the kitchen chatting with our family. Or so they've enabled it, us to have a faster, but they've also enabled a system that means that we don't spend time with each other in the way that we did. And so in addition to the unhealthiness, there's another talk in this series that will talk more about the health nature of foods. But in addition to like the general unhealthiness of them, in terms of like medically unhealthy, there's like a social unhealth. Maybe what's the word I want there? But it enables like a social dysfunction that we didn't used to have, because we had to spend time together, working the land or preparing food. And no, I don't necessarily want to be working all day on the land to, myself, but I did lose something there.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we have in the chat is, what conversation, if any, are you having with your students around the question of taking the life of animals for food? Hunting, culling of domestic animals. How does that show up in your experience?
Yeah, it's a huge question and it's a complicated one. So there's no real simple answer to it, but I know many students are very concerned about it because when they learn about especially industrial meat production, it's very hard not to conclude that it's egregious. It's really, really awful because it has no respect for the lives of the animals that are being killed. Or respect for how the animals are being raised on their way to being killed. So it's a question that opens up into a lot of other domains. I will say that I think what we need to figure out is how to nuance the conversation a little bit more, because not all meat is the same in terms of its moral weight, we might say. And I think it's also important to bring up the question of plants, right? That if you eat at the salad bar, that does not mean you're in a moral free zone, because the raising of our plants also raises a lot of questions, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add to that because I mean I think Norman has said it. We do in my class we visit or we haven't done this yet. We haven't done every single thing yet, but we'll visit a farm here that tries to practice a kind of humane animal husbandry. And they go to quite a lot of lengths to try to do it. But of course the animal does still die, for you to eat it. That's fundamental. And as as they, Saskia Kearns at Duke Campus Farm talked to them about, most of the foods you eat have an environmental cost that is very high, too, right? So, how do you negotiate that, especially since some of the easy solutions that people find, like okay, eat local, et cetera, aren't actually necessarily better, and it's very hard to live in a. This actually reminds me of what's the name of this series? The Good Life? The Good. Okay, so where they talk about the point system and you can't eat a tomato because it sends you to hell because it makes you lose, because the tomato, which you thought was so good, was raised by and harvested by this person who was suffering and caused this environmental damage, et cetera. And it's very hard to be a human in this situation where we don't know where our food comes from and we still need to eat it and we still want to enjoy it. But we are individually responsible for trying to make all the right decisions about it in a system that wasn't set up for ethics.
Yeah. I think just one general thing I would say is that for us to eat, others have to die. That's just a given, and it's the same for every living creature. And so I think the attitude or the sort of the posture principle that we might want to bring to it is to nurture whatever nurtures you, so that you can try to provide for its well-being, even knowing that it's going to be eaten at some point down the road.
Yeah, totally.
We're down to our last few minutes, so I'm going to ask one other question, and I'm going to invite you to do what teachers and preachers so often do, which is give a charge to our listeners, sort of an assignment. But as you do that, one of the questions that's come to us from in the questions is, what vision do you have for a food system for the future? And how would you realistically, what would you most urge those listening to this who share your concerns to incorporate into our lives?
I mean, I think one ideal I saw was to because eating local has its own problems and isn't always good either, but was to have like a globalized local approach, where what we're trying to think about and work for is our systems where, okay, yes, you might still have your bananas and avocados from far away, but but you're thinking of the person behind it and the land behind it. And but that has to be on a systemic level. So like, now's a good chance to pressure your Congress people over the Farm Bill, for example, because that's, been delayed, but it's still there to consider. And it comes every 5 years, and it's a big deal. So, that it's probably not going to be possible for individuals to always make the right choices. And a lot of individuals just can't afford to, right? And also, even if you can't afford to, you don't know. You think that eating local reduces carbon emissions, but it doesn't, or things like that. But yeah, we have to advocate for systemic change, I think.
When I think about this, for me, I eat poorly or make bad choices around food consumption or food production, even when I don't have time, right? When I'm in a rush, and what that does is it creates a kind of mindlessness when we're eating, so we don't even know what we're consuming because we haven't taken the time to try to understand where the food is or even what the food is. We just gobble it up. And so I think the thing that I would recommend to people is to slow down and try to be more mindful about various dimensions of the eating that you do. And it's not all, deprivation, right? When you actually become mindful of the food that you eat, where it comes from, how you prepare it, and you're mindful about who you bring to the table, and then mindful about the time that you spend at the table, it's actually a much, much more pleasurable experience. And so the thing I tell people to do is to simply say, because we're also very busy, is just pick times in the week when you're going to prepare a meal intentionally, where you're going to think about the ingredients you're buying or growing, who you're going to be bringing to your home to share that meal with, how you're going to prepare that food. And then as you're eating this meal together, talking about your experience. What is the food that you're eating? Why do we enjoy it? What do we want to do with our lives together because we now eat together? Right? That becomes a way of reconnecting with each other, reconnecting with the sources of our eating. And hopefully it's a way of also enjoying the life of this world together.
I'm going to add one, if I'm going to take the liberty of adding a coda to that. Certainly, I agree with you that we eat poorly in part because we don't have time or we don't organize our time, as you've just suggested. I think another reason often that we eat poorly is because many of us live alone. And now that I live alone for the first time in several decades, following the death of my husband, I have to be very conscious. Cooking has been an identifying activity for me, but it isn't in the same way now. And so I have to be very conscious of valuing myself enough to eat the kind of meal I would have served when I was living with someone I loved.
I think that's I think that's a really striking thing, Ellen. And I'm sorry for the loss of your husband, but I think that the fact that we are kind of made to share food, we evolved to share food, makes it really quite challenging aspect of loneliness, actually, and being alone. It feeds into each other. I noticed, my husband and my daughter just left for college, and my husband was gone for like a month-long cross-country trip at the same time. And I noticed that I went straight to like just grilled cheese and scrambled eggs, whatever was the least.
And that's a good day.
Yeah, right, exactly. Whatever was just like the least effort, because, it's that engagement with others that really comes, is central to our enjoyment of food. Yeah. I would say, if I were to give a charge to people, I would say, I love Norman's idea. One of the things I charge my students to do as one of their first projects is to search out a food that they're nostalgic for, or that is part of their identities that they grew up with as a child, and then learn how to make it if they don't know how to make it, meaning call their mom, grandmother, somebody, it was an uncle, figure out how to make it with them. They will love it. and then share that with someone else. In our case, it's the class, they share it and they explain. But I would say for you all to try doing that. Try making something that you loved as a child, learn how to make it if you don't, and share it with someone else.
Thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation. It's been a lot of joy for me, and I'm sure for others.
Thank you.
Thank you to Laura, Norman, and Ellen for a great session. That was really wonderful. And to our audience for joining us.